Svadhisthana is the second chakra and its associated element is water. More specifically, it's the water of the seas and the oceans, the vast bodies of water. And last time we looked at Muladhara, the root chakra, and what we saw that was the world of mundanities, the everyday world of bank tellers and laundry, of appointments and practicality. That is the earth and the groundedness of Muladhara. But Svadhisthana is a completely different story. With this second chakra, something new begins to happen. We enter the waters of transformation. We take the night sea journey and we experience an entirely new level of reality. That's what we're going to be exploring on today's episode of The Living Philosophy. Okay, so let's start with some basic facts and symbols of Svadhisthana. So, as we mentioned already, this is the water chakra. So, water in the sense of seas and oceans. It's the vastness and the unknownness of water. But as well as that, it's also the chakra of the half moon. So that invokes visions of the night and visions of transformations taking place. Then we have the animal of this chakra, which is the Makara in Indian mythology, which is the Leviathan in Western mythology. This is the sea monster. It's the whale that swallows Jonah. It's the great monster of the depths. And the other important thing to note is the location of this chakra. So whereas Muladhara was in the perineum, Svadhisthana is located in the small pelvis associated with the genital region. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I guess the first thing to explore is the meaning of the sea and the ocean, the meaning of that water symbol. And this is, of course, the unconscious itself. It is chaos. That is what is contained in the vastness of the ocean, the unfathomable depths, the mysterious monsters that are projected out into the ocean, and the fact that you're at the caprice of storms and winds and you're surrounded by horizon on all sides. So there's that vastness of the unconscious and the sense of the smallness of your being in the midst of the ocean. And this is, of course, the unconscious out of which anything can emerge. And so Svadhisthana, it's what happens when you leave land behind. It's what happens when you leave the earth of Muladhara. And you can think of that earth as being the sense of the world you know, the world you grew up in, the world that makes sense to you. That's what earth is. And you find that the floor disappears from underneath you. You've lost your solid ground and you're afloat in the midst of a vast ocean. And that's what happens when we enter Svadhisthana. And so the two most famous myths associated with Svadhisthana would be the night sea journey. So this is like Jonah getting swallowed by the whale. This is Pinocchio in the belly of that sea monster. And this is tied in with the solar myth of the sun going down over the horizon, dying, being submerged in the water and being born again on the other side as the new sun. So that would be the first myth associated with. The second myth is, of course, the great flood, which is ubiquitous all over the world. And you can think of the flood as this overwhelming of the land, of the earth with water, which again speaks to that transformation point, that emergence of chaos in the middle of order that is Svadhisthana. And so when you enter Svadhisthana, a common thing you will find is dreams of water. I know one woman who, when her husband died, she had these recurring dreams of water and tides rising and sweeping water out of the house. Or Jung talks about in the psychology of Kundalini yoga, he talks about a man who wasn't in analysis who had these recurring dreams of water. A man I know who is not in analysis has had interesting dreams representing this quite frequently, and they were all identical. He found himself moving along a certain road or a little street or path, either in vehicle or on foot. The dream always began with such a movement, and then, to his great amazement, all these roads inevitably led into water, the second chakra. The entrance into Svadhisthana then is the entrance into the unconscious. It's an entirely new form of being that's beginning, and this is where the themes of birth and rebirth tend to get associated in with Svadhisthana. And if you think of the location of the chakra again, this is the location of the womb. This is a return into the waters of the womb, out of which we can be reborn, but not reborn to the world, but reborn to the spirit. And the entrance into the water is the beginning of that rebirth. And this is where the whole mythology and meaning of baptism comes from, because at the start of every initiation, in every mystery cult, you have the initiation into baptism. You are submerged in the waters of the spirit to be reborn. We see it in the Bible in the very first chapter of Mark's Gospel. I think it's 9 verses in, we have Jesus entering the water and the beginning of his ministry on the other side of that baptism. He becomes a Christ on the other side of that baptism. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, You are my son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with wild animals, and angels attended him. So this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and we can map this over onto another major cult in the ancient world, which was the Attis Cult. And the initiates in the Attis Cult were, after they were baptized, their name was changed, and they were fed on milk for 8 days like newborn babies. And so that's the rebirth into the spirit. That's the being fed with the milk. It's being born into a completely new way of being. And that's the essence of Svadhisthana. It's the beginning of this inward journey. It's the beginning of the spiritual journey. We have to re-enter the womb. And of course, there's dangers associated with that. Well attested that many people go into hell, but not all of them come back out. Many people go into the waters of Svadhisthana, but not many re-emerge. And you can even see in some Russian sects that it's not just a submergence in water. You actually have to come close to the point of being drowned. And occasionally, I think people have drowned. And that's taking you to the edge of that, because there's a death before the rebirth. It's something has to die in order for the new thing to be born. So this entrance into Svadhisthana isn't necessarily bright lights and easy going. It's fraught with dangers, and I guess that's what's captured in the idea of the Leviathan, the monster of the depths, and being devoured by that monster. And while there's no guarantee that we will be reborn, it is the possibility of rebirth. It is the possibility of the rejuvenation of our life force through this transformation that Svadhisthana promises or offers or warns us about. This is the dark night of the soul from the Christian mystical tradition. And if you read that medieval Christian book, The Dark Night of the Soul, there's an interesting thing in it that he talks about entering the dark night of the soul and how you might have some degree of control over that, but you cannot control getting out of that dark night of the soul. That only happens by the grace of God. And so you're not praying, your prayers do not control the will of God. It is completely at the mercy of God. It is at the whim of God whether he will bring you into this, or rather out of this dark night of the soul, or whether you will be lost in chaos like so many others. So you're not in control in Svadhisthana. Your ego, your Muladhara ego, is not in control. And it's the emergence of a relationship with that other thing that's beginning with Svadhisthana. And that's the whole spiritual journey itself. It's that reaching out, that commune with something that is higher than you, something that is other than your ego, something that transcends you. And with Svadhisthana, that is the potential to drown. That is the potential for that to be overwhelming and for you not to be prepared for that. And this is why we talk about the importance of a solid ego structure. And Jung thinks a lot of the importance of the first half of life. He doesn't just think we should all be skipping into this spiritual being, but that we need to become rooted. We need to get into our Muladhara before we progress into Svadhisthana. You need to become differentiated from the spiritual infinity that we left from the womb in order to form a connection with that later in life. And in order to survive Svadhisthana, you need to have a solid ego structure. You need to be able to hold the transformation process. And this is the crucible of alchemy. This is being able to hold your feet in the fire. And that requires having a strong and stable ego structure that's not just going to be destroyed by the first wave, by the first flood coming in from Svadhisthana. So there's the tender balance here that you need to have a strong enough ego in order to go into these waters and not to become dissolved, in order to hold your own structure and be able to maintain that the pressure of that transformation process. And so this is something we'll probably go more into in the Manipura episode on the next chakra. And it's just we have entered Nigredo here. We've entered the first stage of alchemy, the blackening. And the thing that we're awaking here, the thing that's been awoken in Svadhisthana, that higher thing that by the grace of God can bring us out of this darkness, that becomes clearer once you go through Manipura and come up to Anahata, the heart chakra. In Anahata, we've moved past the drowning in the waters. We've moved past the fire of Manipura, and it's beginning to come up into the air, coming up into the revelation of that higher thing, which Jung would call the self, and I guess the Christians would call God. And so the emergence of this can destroy us, but if it doesn't destroy us, it gives us a great boon. There's a great reward. There's a great transformation that comes with it, which Joseph Campbell captures very well with one African myth in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. A dangerous, one-legged, one-armed, one-sided figure, the half-man, invisible if viewed from the offside, is encountered in many parts of the earth. In Central Africa, it is declared that such a half-man says to the person who has encountered him, "Since you have met with me, let us fight together." If thrown, he will plead, "Do not kill me, I will show you lots of medicines," and then the lucky person becomes a proficient doctor. But if the half-man, called Chirui, a mysterious thing, wins, his victim dies. And that's the essence of Svadhisthana. You can die here, you can drown here, but if you can make it through, the half-man will teach you the medicines. You can learn a whole new type of wisdom. You can become a healer. And that ties in with the Jungian saying that only the wounded physician can heal. And Rumi's saying that it's the wound that lets the light in. So Svadhisthana is that wound. It's the opening of that wound and the meeting with the deluge of the inner world. And of course, the water is not the only way that this symbol is manifested. Svadhisthana can be illustrated. So there's also the sense of the underground, because it's the going into and going down into the earth, into the new womb. And so we see that in the crypts of old churches. They have under churches. You have crypts underneath the main church. The old Attis cult that we referenced earlier, they used to take place in grottos, as did the Mithras cult. So there's something about going into this underground space that also captures that same thing. It's the darkness and the claustrophobia, I guess, the depth, the unknown swaddling you that is that Svadhisthana experience. And another great example is Theseus's myth. So when Theseus goes into the labyrinth in Crete, and we see that in the center of this dark labyrinth that is underground, there is the Minotaur, the half man, half bull, and you can think of that as the Leviathan in that myth. It's the thing at the center of this maze in which you can get lost, in which there's such treachery. And that is the monster of the unconscious that we have to meet, the monster we have to defeat in order to come through to the other side. Svadhisthana is also the first step in the Jed McKenna version of the world. This is the step beyond which you cannot go back, the point at which your transformation kind of takes care of itself and you just hit a steep cliff edge off which you are falling and inevitably sliding towards wisdom, I guess. It's the point of no return. And a man who had a dream just before he entered analysis said, "I stood before a dark cave wanting to go in, and I shuddered at the thought that I might not be able to find my way back." And the truth is that you can't go back. This is, once you undertake this journey, you are transformed forever. It is Ahab having lost the leg. You are maimed. You are a different person now. Something has been left behind. So in Ahab's case, it's the leg. In the case of Odin or Wotan and Osiris in the Egyptian tradition, that is the eye. And these gods have lost that eye, and that's the sense of the eye being turned to the inner world. So in Wotan's case, it's thrown down to the bottom of a well. And again, that invokes this Svadhisthana. It's turned into that inner world of water and depth. And so we always have one eye facing outward and one eye facing inward once we've entered into Svadhisthana, once we've entered into that transformational process. I think another important point to note is the connection between Svadhisthana and grief. Grief is that it's the drowning in emotions. There's something that you've lost, there's a diminishment, and this is what happens when you enter the midlife crisis, the midlife transition, is that you've lost your youth is now behind you, and it's the grief of that drives you into the midlife transition. You've lost touch with those potentialities, all the things you've built, all the things you've gained that seem so important in your Muladhara phase of life. All that gold turns to ashes in your hand, and you're left with the grief of the unlived life, of the potentialities that are gone, and that is the beginning of the descent and of the turning inward in the Jungian tradition. Entering Svadhisthana is not fun, and that connection with grief is essential in understanding that this is not a place you want to go. This is not a holiday trip, and you see that very well in Jed McKenna's second book, where you see the letters coming through from this woman who's going through the spiritual autolysis, and it's like she's being eviscerated. The amount of material that is coming up, the amount of transformational things that are happening, and as we'll see with Manipura, that is like being on fire. It's all the non-essential aspects of you are being burned off. And this is the death of the phoenix. So this second chakra is grief. It's the loss, and that again is the water. It's the water of sadness, the water of eternal melancholy. And so that brings us on to the question of how do you enter Svadhisthana? How do you move from Muladhara into Svadhisthana? And the answer is, of course, you awaken the snake Kundalini, which rises and pulls you up into Svadhisthana. And the way to awaken the snake Kundalini is by having a purified mind. That would be the traditional answer. But psychologically, what that means is you've dealt with the worldly. The worldly is put to bed. You've purified your mind of those worldly desires and urges. And there's two ways of doing that. There's the ascetic way, which is the monk turning his back on the worldly things, renouncing the world. And the other path is the more modern path, I guess, of the householder, and that is by reaching the stage in midlife where you have kind of sorted the worldly things, where your career is in order, your family is in order, and these things stop losing meaning. The things that drew you on when you were younger begin to lose meaning. The scales fall from your eyes and you enter that grief of the midlife transition. And that is how Svadhisthana emerges. Your mind has been purified of the world. You've put it to bed. So your mind is now freed up. You have all these extra capacity with which to begin on this journey. And that is the Kundalini awakening. That is the purified mind, which now is bothered by greater problems, which now needs to go deeper into problems because the worldly is kind of put behind it. And it's not really something that you willfully get into. That's the thing of, it's that turning of all your achievements into ash in your hand. It's the sense of loss, the sense of grief that drives you on into Svadhisthana. It needs to be something that's greater than your willful control, because what happens is that this process is painful. This process is not desirable. And so once you're in the midst of it, once you've gone into the waters, if you could go back, you would with your will. Because it's this terrible experience. The dark night of the soul is not a pleasant place to be. And so the necessity is for it to be something greater than your will driving you on. And that's the energy of Kundalini. And Jung shares the story of one Christian monk in the Middle Ages who tells a story, I guess, like Dante's Inferno, where he goes into the dark forest and goes on this sort of a journey. And there he loses his way and then a wolf appears. At first he's afraid, but afterward he follows the wolf to a spring where he drinks of the water, an allusion to baptism. Then he comes to the ruins of an ancient Roman town, and he goes in through the gate and sees statues and peculiar symbolic inscriptions. Then suddenly he is afraid. It becomes uncanny. He wants to go back and he turns to go out through the gate again, but now there is a dragon sitting behind him that bars the way, and he cannot go back. He simply must go forward. The dragon is Kundalini. You see, the Kundalini in psychological terms is that which makes you go on the greatest adventures. I say, oh damn, why did I ever try such a thing? But if I turn back, then the whole adventure goes out of my life, and my life is nothing any longer. It has lost its flavour. It is this quest that makes life livable, and this is Kundalini. This is the divine urge. And you can easily make the connection here with that pivotal moment in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo has to leave the Fellowship behind. He knows that he has to do this. It's not something, it's circumstances have compelled him to make this decision. But it's a very unpleasant decision. It's not something that he wants to do, and we see him having that moment of reflection by the waterside.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.
This is the Kundalini driving him on. He has no choice here. He's caught between a rock and a hard place, and he knows what he has to do, and he has no choice but just to keep on going. And this could really be the barometer for Svadhisthana. It's, if you don't find yourself terrified, if you don't find yourself wanting to turn back, then you're probably not in Svadhisthana. You're probably in an image of Svadhisthana that you've created in your mind, and this is what we call spiritual bypassing, where it's this muladhara desire to, it's the affectation of a Svadhisthana journey. But if you're not in great pain, if you're not mired in the depths, then you're probably not in Svadhisthana. It's wanting the light without going through the heat, and you just can't have a true experience of the light without that heat, without that pressure of transformation. And in Frodo's journey, you can see that success is not guaranteed. It's very far from being guaranteed. By crossing that river, he heads into the great unknown, heading towards the land of great evil, and he doesn't know how this is going to play out. It could very well, it seems very likely that he will be destroyed, and it's a great encapsulation of the fact that it's only by the grace of God, it's only by the grace of a higher fate that Frodo succeeds here. And that's really the attitude you got to take with Svadhisthana, that when you're there, it will seem impossible. It will seem like you cannot get beyond this. That's what it is to be truly drowning. It's not some flashy spiritual experience. It really seems very unlikely that you can make it through. It really seems very unlikely that you can survive. And it makes you dream of home. It makes you dream of more comfortable times, and it makes you want to be back there and actually be grateful for what you had back then. What you know that you have to go on. And as we see in Frodo's case, circumstances conspire for his success to come through, and that is the grace of God that we have to pray for in our own times of Svadhisthana, and that's the real danger of the drowning, I guess. And yeah, that's the womb of Svadhisthana. It could be womb or it could be tomb. It could be the new birth, or it could be the final death, final destruction. And it's the connection with the moon that establishes this night sea journey, this journey into the bowels of the unknown, into the very depths of the water, into the depths of chaos, and you're walking the knife edge at that point. So that's about everything that I want to cover. I mean, it's a subject that maps out so much because there's so much symbol, there's so much mythology around, especially this initial part of the entering upon the transformational journey. But we'll stop it here unless it turns into a very long episode. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any thoughts, feedback or insights, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. And otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.